King Silas lit the match himself. He watched the flames rise, believing he was purging a curse. But when the fire died down, the ashes revealed a secret that would break him. Dawn broke gray and cold over the execution grounds. The crowd had dispersed hours ago, their bloodlust satisfied, their fear temporarily appeased. Silas knelt alone in the dirt where the pyre had stood, his royal robes soiled with soot and ash. His hands trembled as they sifted through the still warm remains, though he couldn't name what compelled him to search. Guilt, perhaps, or the fading echo of her final screams, words he'd refused to hear over the roar of the flames. His fingers closed around something solid, smooth, impossibly intact. The sunstone pendant emerged from the ash like an accusation. The delicate crystal he'd given Iris just weeks ago, the family heirloom that had hung clear and pale at her throat. But now it pulsed with inner light, glowing a deep, undeniable blood red. Silas stopped breathing. The ancient magic couldn't lie. The pendant only turned crimson when touched by one thing: royal blood growing in the womb. She was telling the truth. 3 months earlier, autumn should have brought harvest. Instead, it brought death. King Silas stood at the tall windows of his throne room, watching smoke rise from the fields beyond the castle walls. The farmers were burning their crops again, blackened wheat stalks that had rotted from the inside out, potatoes that turned to putrid mush in the ground, apple trees whose fruit fell unripe and crawling with decay. The mysterious blight had started small, confined to the northern provinces, but it spread like a stain across Oakhaven until no corner of the kingdom remained untouched. Your Majesty, the grain stores in the eastern districts are nearly depleted. Lord Chancellor Wexford's voice was tight with barely concealed panic. We have perhaps 6 weeks before widespread famine becomes inevitable. Silas turned from the window to face his council. 7 men sat around the great oak table, their faces gaunt with worry. Maps covered the surface, marked with red ink denoting affected areas. There was more red than unmarked parchment now. What of the livestock? Silas asked, though he already knew the answer. Sickening faster than we can slaughter them for meat, Wexford replied. The cattle develop a wasting disease. The sheep go blind and starve, even the chickens. Enough. High Priest Lucius rose from his seat at the far end of the table, his ceremonial robes rustling like dead leaves. He was a tall man, rail-thin, with eyes that seemed to look through rather than at people. We all know the cause of this suffering. The land itself is crying out. Silas felt his jaw tighten. Lucius, if you're about to cite divine displeasure again, the gods demand continuity, Your Majesty. Lucius's voice carried the smooth certainty of a man who'd never questioned his own righteousness. A kingdom without an heir is a body without a soul. The earth recognizes this violation of natural order. Your bloodline fails, and so the land fails with it. Superstitious nonsense, Silas muttered, but even he could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. He was a man of reason, educated in philosophy and natural law, yet reason had provided no answers for the blight. Science had failed where faith at least offered an explanation, however backward. Is it? Lucius moved closer, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous throne room. You are 42 years old, Your Majesty. You have entertained 7 marriage proposals from the finest noble houses in the realm. 7 women, all healthy, all fertile, yet you dismissed each one. Why? Because none of them made him feel anything but empty. Because the thought of touching them, of performing the mechanical duty of producing an heir, filled him with cold dread. Because he'd rather die alone than spend his life with someone he couldn't even speak to honestly. But he couldn't say that aloud. The matches were unsuitable, Silas said instead. No, Your Majesty. Lucius's voice dropped to something almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. You are afraid that you cannot sire a child, that you are incapable, that the fault lies not with the women, but with you. The words hit like physical blows because they were true. Silas had lain awake countless nights wondering if he was cursed, if some fundamental defect in his nature made him unable to continue his line. Every failed courtship reinforced the fear. Every year that passed without an heir deepened the certainty that he was broken. The gods are patient, but not infinitely so, Lucius continued. Every day you delay, more of your people starve. The blight will not end until the natural order is restored. You need an heir, Your Majesty. The gods demand it. After the council dismissed, Silas remained alone in the throne room until darkness fell. The great chandelier above cast wavering shadows across the walls, making the portraits of his ancestors seem to move, to judge. 43 kings had sat on this throne before him. All had produced heirs. All had fulfilled their sacred duty. All except him. He couldn't bear another night within these walls, surrounded by expectations he couldn't meet, and advisors who saw him as a failed vessel rather than a man. He needed air. He needed to think. Most of all, he needed to escape the weight of the crown, if only for a few hours. Silas changed into simple merchant's clothes, plain wool tunic, worn leather boots, a dark cloak with a deep hood. The castle guards knew to turn blind eyes when the king walked at night. It was an old habit, one he'd never broken even after taking the throne. In the lower city, without his crown and royal bearing, he was just another tired man seeking solace in anonymity. The streets of Oakhaven's merchant quarter were quieter than they should have been at this hour. Normally, the taverns would overflow with laughter and music, but tonight only a handful of establishments showed light. The blight had stolen more than crops, it had stolen hope, joy, the simple pleasure of gathering without the shadow of starvation looming. Silas walked without destination, letting his feet carry him down narrow alleys and across empty squares. He passed shuttered shops and dark windows. He heard a woman weeping behind a closed door, the sound raw and hopeless. He saw a child digging through refuse, looking for anything edible. This was his kingdom. These were his people, and he was failing them. He turned a corner into the slums, where the houses leaned against each other like drunks, and stopped short. A crowd had gathered in a small courtyard, their voices raised in desperate prayer. Candles flickered on makeshift altars. At the center of the gathering, a woman knelt beside a small body laid out on a blanket, a child, perhaps 6 years old, seized by violent tremors. "Please," the mother sobbed, clutching her son's hand. "Please, someone help him. The fever won't break. He won't wake." An elderly priest made the sign of blessing over the child but shook his head. "I'm sorry. The plague fever. Once it reaches this stage, there's nothing to be done. Prepare yourself. Make peace." "No." The mother's scream tore through the night. "No, he's all I have. There must be something, someone. Let me through." A woman's voice, calm and clear, cut through the chaos. The crowd parted, and Silas watched as a figure approached the dying child, a woman in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back from an intelligent face and hands that moved with absolute confidence. She carried a worn leather satchel that clinked with glass vials. "Who are you?" the priest demanded. "Lady Iris," she replied without looking at him, already kneeling beside the child. "I'm a healer. Let me work." She moved with purpose, checking the child's pulse, peeling back his eyelids, pressing her ear to his chest. Then she opened her satchel and began mixing something herbs and powders Silas couldn't identify, ground together with practiced efficiency. "Witchcraft," someone in the crowd whispered. "Science," Iris corrected sharply. "The fever is caused by infection. I'm going to reduce the inflammation and bring down his temperature. If you want to help, bring me cold water. If you want to hinder, leave." For 20 minutes, Silas watched this stranger work miracles. She administered her remedy, cooled the child's burning skin, whispered encouragement to the terrified mother. And slowly, impossibly, the child's tremors eased. His breathing steadied. His eyes fluttered open. "Mama?" the boy whispered. The mother collapsed over her son, weeping with joy now instead of grief. The crowd erupted in astonished prayer. The priest made the sign of blessing again, this time over Iris herself. but she was already packing her satchel, preparing to slip away unnoticed. Silas found himself moving before conscious thought formed. He caught up with her 3 streets away, where she'd paused beneath a sputtering oil lamp to reorganize her supplies. "That was remarkable," he said. She glanced up, startled, then relaxed when she saw only a common merchant. It was medicine, not magic, though people rarely understand the difference. "You saved that child's life. I treated an infection with anti-inflammatory herbs and fever reduction techniques, documented in medical texts from the old empire. There's nothing miraculous about it." She studied him with sharp, assessing eyes. "You're not from this quarter." "I'm traveling through." "At midnight? In the slums?" A slight smile touched her lips. "You're either running from something or searching for it." Searching. The word resonated in his chest like a bell. Yes, he was searching for answers, for hope, for something his advisors and priests couldn't provide. "The child would have died," Silas said quietly. "The priest had given up. You didn't. The priest sees patterns and calls them fate. I see patterns and call them problems to solve." Iris closed her satchel with a decisive snap. Fever doesn't care about prayers. It responds to treatment. For the first time in months, Silas felt something shift inside him, a crack in the wall of resignation he'd built around himself. This woman spoke of disease as something that could be understood, challenged, defeated, not as divine punishment or mystical curse, but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. "I'd like to speak with you again," he heard himself say. "About medicine. About your work." Iris tilted her head, curious. "Why?" "Because you're brilliant. Because you don't see impossibility where everyone else does. Because talking to you for 5 minutes has given me more hope than a year of prayers. Because I think you might have answers I need," Silas said instead. She considered this, then nodded slowly. "Tomorrow evening, the cottage with the blue door on Ashwood Lane, but come with questions worth asking." Then she was gone, disappearing into the shadows like smoke. Silas stood alone beneath the lamp, feeling something he'd almost forgotten: possibility. Silas returned the next evening, and the evening after that, and every night for 2 weeks. The cottage with the blue door sat at the end of Ashwood Lane, half hidden behind an overgrown garden that smelled of rosemary and thyme. The first time Silas knocked, he half expected Iris to turn him away, to dismiss the strange merchant who'd appeared from nowhere with questions about medicine. Instead, she opened the door, looked him up and down with those sharp, assessing eyes, and said, "You came. Good. I hate wasting interesting conversations." The cottage interior was chaos, organized by a mind that saw connections invisible to others. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams. Books precious. Rare books lay open on every surface, their margins filled with handwritten notes. Glass vials lined makeshift shelves, each labeled in precise script: willow bark extract, feverfew tincture, chamomile distillation. In the corner, a small fire burned beneath a copper pot, filling the air with the sharp scent of boiling roots. "You're self-taught," Silas observed, running his fingers along the spine of a medical text he recognized from the Royal Library. Or rather, one he'd thought existed only in the Royal Library. "I learned to read from a merchant who accepted healing in trade for lessons," Iris said, crushing dried leaves with a mortar and pestle. "After that, I collected knowledge wherever I could find it. Books left behind by travelers, techniques from midwives, trial and error with plants from the forest." She looked up, a strand of dark hair falling across her face. "The priests call it witchcraft because they can't explain it. I call it observation." They talked until the fire burned low. Silas asked about her methods for treating infection, her theories on disease transmission, her experiments with pain management. Iris answered with the precision of a scholar and the passion of someone who devoted her life to understanding what others dismissed as unknowable. "The plague fever follows a pattern," she explained, sketching diagrams on a piece of slate. "It spreads through close contact, person to person. The symptoms progress in stages, first the tremors, then the high fever, then the breathing difficulties. If you intervene early with anti-inflammatory herbs and temperature reduction, you can halt the progression. The court physicians say fever is caused by an imbalance of humors, Silas said carefully, not revealing that he sat in on those very discussions. Iris snorted. The court physicians are idiots repeating thousand-year-old nonsense. Fever is the body's response to invasion, by disease, by infection. It's trying to burn out the enemy, but sometimes it burns too hot and kills the patient instead. You have to help the body fight without letting it destroy itself. She met his eyes. That's not magic. That's understanding how things work. For the first time in years, Silas felt truly engaged. Not performing the role of king, not managing advisors and nobles, but simply thinking, questioning, learning. Iris challenged every assumption he'd been taught to accept. She demonstrated that what appeared supernatural often had perfectly rational explanations if you had the courage to look closely enough. On the 5th night, she showed him her garden by lantern light. Every plant has properties, she said, kneeling to examine a cluster of purple flowers. This is foxglove. In tiny amounts, it can steady an irregular heartbeat. In large amounts, it stops the heart entirely. The difference between medicine and poison is often just a matter of dosage. That's terrifying, Silas murmured. That's why it requires precision. She plucked a single leaf. Most healers are afraid of this plant. They see the danger and run from it. I see the danger and learn to control it. Knowledge removes fear. He understood then why the priests called her dangerous. Not because she practiced dark arts, but because she refused to accept that anything was beyond human understanding. She threatened the comfortable certainty of divine mystery with the uncomfortable possibility of comprehensible truth. On the 8th night, sitting across from each other at her small table with cups of bitter herbal tea between them, Iris asked the question he'd been dreading. Who are you really? Silas's hand stilled on his cup. What do you mean? You're educated far beyond what a merchant should be. You recognize rare medical texts on sight. Your questions are sophisticated, like someone who sat in on court physician discussions. She tilted her head. And you walk like someone accustomed to people moving out of your way. For a long moment, silence filled the cottage. The fire crackled. Outside, rain began to fall. If I tell you, Silas said quietly, everything changes. Then don't tell me. Iris shrugged. Keep your secrets, but know that I prefer honesty to mystery. He made his decision in that instant, perhaps the most reckless decision of his life. I'm King Silas. Iris blinked. Once, twice. Then she laughed. A short, sharp sound of disbelief. No, you're not. I am. He pushed back his hood fully, letting the firelight illuminate his face. I've been coming here in disguise because I needed to escape the castle, to think without advisors breathing down my neck, to talk to someone who sees the world differently. The laughter died. Iris stared at him, truly seeing him for the first time, and her expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something between amusement and exasperation. You're serious? Completely. The King of Oakhaven has been sitting in my cottage for 8 days, drinking terrible tea and listening to me call his court physicians idiots. They are idiots, Silas said. You were right about that. Iris stood abruptly, paced to the window, then back. I should curtsy. Shouldn't I curtsy? I've never curtsied in my life. Please don't. Silas remained seated, keeping his voice steady. I came here because I wanted to be treated like a person, not a crown. If you start bowing and scraping now, I'll have to find another healer to debate with. She stopped pacing, studying him with new intensity. Why are you really here, Your Majesty? Silas, just Silas, when we're alone. He met her gaze. I'm here because my kingdom is dying, and no one at court can tell me why. Because High Priest Lucius insists it's divine punishment for my failure to produce an heir, and I'm starting to fear he might be right. Because I'm 42 years old and I've resigned myself to dying without a son, and that resignation is eating me alive. He paused. And because when I watched you save that child, I saw someone who refuses to accept that anything is impossible. I needed that. I need to believe problems have solutions. Iris returned to her seat slowly, her expression softer now. The blight isn't divine punishment. How can you be certain? Because gods don't target wheat root systems with fungal infections. The blight is a disease, like any other. It has a cause, and causes can be identified and addressed. She leaned forward. As for your heir problem, have you considered that maybe the issue isn't divine displeasure, but simply that you haven't met the right person? 7 noble daughters would disagree. Were you in love with any of them? The question hit him like cold water. Love isn't a requirement for producing an heir. No, but desire is, and I suspect you can't desire someone you don't even like. Iris's eyes held his. King or commoner, fever doesn't care about your crown. Neither does conception. Your body knows the difference between duty and genuine connection. It was the most honest assessment anyone had given him, the most respectful in its complete lack of deference. Silas felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking, but opening. Like a door he'd kept locked finally admitting light. I should go, he said, though he made no move to stand. It's late. Come back tomorrow, Iris said. I want to show you my research on the blight. I've been collecting samples from affected crops. There are patterns. Patterns you can solve? Patterns I can try to solve. That's all science is trying until something works. Silas left the cottage that night feeling lighter than he had in months. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and fresh. He walked through the empty streets with his hood up, just another shadow in the darkness, and allowed himself something he'd forbidden for years: hope. He returned every night after that. They analyzed blight samples under candlelight, debated theories of disease transmission, argued about the line between observation and speculation. Iris never once called him Your Majesty, unless she was mocking his stubbornness. She challenged him, frustrated him, made him laugh at himself. And slowly, inevitably, he fell in love. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was the quiet accumulation of 100 small moments. The way she chewed her lip when concentrating. The fierce joy in her eyes when an experiment succeeded. The gentleness in her hands when treating the sick who came to her door. She was brilliant and stubborn and utterly without pretense. 1 month after their first meeting, sitting beside each other, examining fungal samples through a magnifying lens, their hands brushed, Silas looked up and found Iris watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. What? He asked. I'm trying to decide if this is wise, she said softly. If what is wise? Falling for a king who comes to me in disguise because he can't stand his own castle. His breath caught. And what have you decided? That wisdom is overrated. She leaned forward and kissed him brief, certain, irrevocable. When they broke apart, Silas touched his forehead to hers. I don't know how this works. I don't know what we can be. Then we'll figure it out, Iris whispered, like everything else, through observation and trial. For the first time since taking the throne, Silas allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't suffocating duty and inevitable failure. A future with someone who saw him, truly saw him, and chose him anyway. Outside, the kingdom continued to wither, but in the cottage with the blue door, something new was beginning to grow. The affair bloomed like a night flower hidden from daylight, thriving in secrecy, beautiful and fragile and dangerous. Silas began dividing his life into 2 halves. The king, who sat in council meetings and issued proclamations he didn't believe in, and the man who walked through dark streets to reach a blue door at the end of Ashwood Lane. The second half felt more real than the first. In Iris's cottage, surrounded by herb bundles and flickering candles, he could strip away the weight of the crown and simply exist. They talked endlessly. About everything, about nothing. Iris told him about growing up in the merchant quarter, daughter of a seamstress who died when she was 12. How she'd learned to read by trading healing services for lessons. How every book she owned had been purchased with coins, saved from treating dock workers and tavern keepers who couldn't afford court physicians. Knowledge shouldn't belong only to those who can pay for it, she said one evening, reorganizing her shelves for the third time that week. Medicine, philosophy, science, these things determine how we understand the world. When you lock them behind castle walls and church doors, you condemn ordinary people to ignorance. Some would say ignorance is safer, Silas replied, watching her work with undisguised fascination. That common people aren't equipped to handle complex ideas. She turned to face him, eyes blazing. Some would say a king who believes that doesn't deserve his throne. Anyone else would have been executed for such words. Silas laughed until his sides hurt. That was the gift Iris gave him, the freedom to be challenged, even insulted, without the suffocating deference that colored every other interaction in his life. She argued with him about governance, called his policies short-sighted, told him his advisors were cowards more interested in maintaining power than serving people. And she was right. About almost everything, she was infuriatingly right. But it wasn't just intellectual connection that bound them. 3 weeks into their secret meetings, Silas arrived at the cottage with a blinding headache, the kind that made light feel like knives and sound like thunder. He'd suffered from them his entire adult life, enduring them with gritted teeth because court physicians had no remedy beyond bloodletting, which only made things worse. "Sit," Iris commanded, guiding him to a chair. "Don't talk, don't move, just breathe." She disappeared into her storage room and returned with a small vial of dark liquid. The scent was sharp, almost medicinal peppermint and something earthier, more bitter. "Feverfew and willow bark in alcohol suspension," she explained, measuring drops into a cup of water. "It won't cure the headache instantly, but it should ease the worst of it within the hour. Drink slowly." Silas obeyed, too miserable to question. The taste was vile, but he forced it down. Then Iris did something unexpected. She moved behind him and placed her hands on his temples, fingers cool and steady, and began to massage in slow circles. "Tension makes it worse," she murmured. "You carry all your stress here, in your jaw and forehead. I can feel the knots." Her touch was professional at first, therapeutic. But as the minutes passed and the medicine began to work its subtle magic, something shifted. Her fingers moved to his scalp, threading through his hair. Silas's breathing deepened. The pain receded, replaced by a different kind of intensity awareness of every point where her skin met his. The warmth of her body close behind him, the faint scent of rosemary, and something uniquely her. "Better?" she asked softly. "Yes," his voice came out rough. "Much better." He should have thanked her and left, should have maintained the careful distance they'd both been pretending still existed. Instead, he turned in the chair and found her face inches from his, her pupils dilated in the dim light, her breath catching. "Iris," he said, and it was a question and a warning and a plea all at once. She answered by closing the distance between them. The kiss was tentative at first, a test, a question neither of them had dared to ask aloud. Then it deepened, became something urgent and inevitable. Silas stood, pulling her closer, and she responded with equal hunger, fingers tangling in his hair, body pressing against his with a rightness that felt like coming home. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Iris laughed, a sound somewhere between joy and disbelief. "This is spectacularly unwise," she said. "I know. You're the king. I'm a common healer. This could destroy both of us." "I know. And I don't care." She kissed him again, fiercer this time. "I don't care at all." The affair that followed was passionate and reckless and achingly tender. Silas had never experienced anything like it, not in his brief, dutiful marriage years ago that ended with his young wife's death in childbirth, not in the mechanical arrangements proposed by noble families seeking alliance. This was desire married to genuine affection, physical pleasure intertwined with intellectual companionship. Iris challenged him in bed as she challenged him everywhere else, and he loved her for it. For the first time in his adult life, Silas felt fully alive. The hours spent in Iris's cottage became the moments he lived for. Everything else, the council meetings, the formal dinners, The endless succession of duties that filled his days became the dream, gray and insubstantial. Reality was her laugh in the darkness, her body warm beside his, her voice arguing some obscure philosophical point while they lay tangled in her narrow bed. But secrecy had its costs. They couldn't be seen together publicly. Silas's visits had to be carefully timed, disguised, erased from memory. And as Iris's reputation as a healer grew, word spreading about the woman who could cure plague fever and ease chronic pain, so did unwanted attention. The local priests began watching her cottage. They questioned her patience, demanding to know what methods she used, what incantations she spoke, what gods she prayed to. Iris ignored them, which only made things worse. "They're afraid of you," Silas said one evening, after she'd described the latest interrogation. "You make them irrelevant. If people can solve their problems without prayer, what use are priests?" "Then let them be afraid," Iris replied with characteristic defiance. "I won't apologize for helping people. You should be more careful. These men have power. Less power than they think." But she squeezed his hand, acknowledging the concern beneath his warning. "I'll be cautious. I promise." Silas used what influence he could to protect her. Quiet words to the captain of the city guard, ensuring her cottage was included in regular patrols. Anonymous donations to the local church, buying goodwill even as he despised having to do so. It wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough, but openly defending her would raise questions he couldn't answer without exposing their relationship. 2 months into their affair, on a night when autumn had surrendered fully to winter's advance, Silas brought a gift. The small velvet pouch felt heavy in his pocket as he made his way to Ashwood Lane, heart beating faster than the walk warranted. Iris opened the door, took one look at his face, and smiled. "What have you done?" "I don't know what you mean." "You're nervous. You're never nervous." She pulled him inside, closed the door against the cold. "What is it?" He drew out the pouch and placed it in her hands. "Open it." The sunstone pendant spilled onto her palm a crystal the size of a robin's egg, perfectly clear, hanging from a delicate silver chain. It caught the firelight and threw prismatic colors across her skin. "Silas," she breathed. I can't accept this. This is a royal heirloom." "It belonged to my grandmother," he said, taking the pendant and fastening it around her neck. His fingers brushed her collarbone and she shivered. "She told me it was blessed, that it carried the protection of old magic. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if I believe in magic at all anymore, but I know I want you to have it." Iris touched the crystal with reverent fingers. Against her throat, it gleamed pale as moonlight. "Why?" "Because you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." He cupped her face in his hands. "Hope. Purpose. A reason to imagine a future that isn't just slow decline into irrelevance. When I'm with you, I can believe that impossible problems have solutions. That I'm not cursed. That maybe." He hesitated, then said what he'd been afraid to voice. "That maybe I could be happy." Tears glittered in her eyes. "I love you," she whispered. "I know I shouldn't. I know it's dangerous. But I do. I love you too." The words felt like a door opening onto something vast and terrifying. "I don't know how this ends. I don't know what we can be, but I want to try." They made love that night with unusual tenderness, the pendant catching firelight between them, and afterward lay wrapped in each other while winter wind rattled the windows. Neither of them knew that the crystal's faint glow had shifted almost imperceptibly, taking on the barest hint of pink. Neither of them knew what that meant. And neither of them saw the figure watching from the shadows across the lane, tall and gaunt in priestly robes, face hidden beneath a deep hood. High Priest Lucius had suspected the king's distraction had a source. Now he had confirmation. He watched until the fire inside burned low and the cottage fell dark, then turned and walked back toward the castle, his mind already working through the implications. The healer had to be removed. Not immediately, that would be too obvious. But soon. Before her influence over the king became unshakable. Before she convinced him to ignore the natural order that demanded royal heirs and divine favor. before she destroyed everything Lucius had spent 3 decades building. He would need to be clever about this, patient. The king was clearly besotted, which made him dangerous to confront directly. But every man had weaknesses. Every relationship had fractures. Lucius simply needed to find them and apply the right pressure. He smiled in the darkness, a thin expression of cold calculation, and began to plan. High Priest Lucius had spent 30 years learning how to read men's souls through the masks they wore. Kings, nobles, merchants, peasants, all believed they could hide their true natures behind careful words and practiced expressions. None of them understood that Lucius saw everything. The slight hesitation before a lie, the quickening pulse at a throat when guilty secrets were mentioned, the way eyes tracked toward windows when thoughts strayed to forbidden desires. King Silas had become sloppy. It started small. A distracted quality during morning prayers, as though his mind wandered elsewhere while reciting sacred texts. Arriving late to council meetings with poor excuses about reviewing grain reports. Most damningly, a lightness in his bearing that Lucius hadn't seen in years, the posture of a man no longer crushed beneath the weight of his failures. The king was happy. That alone was suspicious. Lucius began watching more carefully. He noted the evenings when Silas dismissed his guards early, claiming he wanted to walk the castle battlements alone. The nights when the king's chambers remained dark for hours, suggesting he wasn't inside them at all. The subtle change in how Silas argued during council sessions, less defeated, more engaged, as though someone had reminded him he possessed a spine. Someone was influencing the king. Someone who made him feel capable, powerful, less dependent on the counsel of those who'd guided him for decades. That was unacceptable. Lucius waited until a moonless night, then followed when Silas left the castle in his merchant's disguise. He kept his distance, moving through shadows like a ghost, years of practice making him nearly invisible. The king walked with purpose through the upper city, down into the merchant quarter, and finally into the slums, a destination that made Lucius's stomach tighten with apprehension. When Silas knocked on a blue door at the end of Ashwood Lane, and a woman answered with a smile that lit her entire face, Lucius felt cold fury crystallize in his chest. The healer. That damned healer who'd been causing trouble for months, treating the sick with methods that skirted dangerously close to forbidden practices. The woman who'd been questioned by local priests and dismissed their concerns with barely concealed contempt. Lucius watched through a gap in the shutters as Silas took the woman in his arms and kissed her with an intimacy that spoke of long familiarity. He watched them talk and laugh and touch each other with the casual affection of established lovers. He watched the king, his king, whom Lucius had advised since before he took the throne, look at this common woman with an expression of complete adoration. Everything made terrible sense now. The distraction, the happiness, the reduced dependence on priestly counsel. Silas had found something he valued more than tradition, more than duty, more than the spiritual guidance that had sustained the crown for generations. He'd found love. Lucius waited in the cold for 3 hours, until the king finally emerged and made his way back toward the castle. Only then did the priest return to his chambers in the cathedral, mind racing with implications. This relationship threatened everything, not just Lucius's personal influence, though that was certainly at stake, but the entire structure of power that kept the kingdom functioning. Kings did not marry common healers. They did not elevate peasants to positions of authority. They certainly did not allow themselves to be distracted from their sacred duty to produce legitimate heirs with appropriate noble bloodlines. If this affair continued, if it became public, the consequences would be catastrophic. The noble houses would revolt. The church would be forced to condemn the king for violating sacred law. The kingdom, already weakened by blight and famine, would tear itself apart. The healer had to be removed, for the good of Oakhaven, for the preservation of order, for the king's own protection, whether he understood that or not. But Lucius was not impulsive. He'd maintained power for 3 decades by being patient, thorough, and strategic. Directly attacking the king's lover would backfire. Silas would defend her, possibly even reveal the relationship publicly in some misguided attempt at honor. No, this required subtlety, evidence. a crime so clear that even the besotted king couldn't deny it. Lucius began his investigation the next morning. He questioned the local priests who'd expressed concerns about the healer's methods, encouraging them to document every suspicious incident. He spoke with patients she'd treated, looking for complaints or accusations of improper conduct. He searched church records for any mention of her family, hoping to find connections to known heretics or practitioners of forbidden arts. For 2 weeks, he found nothing useful. Lady Iris was exactly what she appeared to be, a skilled healer who used herbal remedies and observation-based techniques to treat illness. Her patients praised her. Her methods, while unorthodox, produced results. Even the priests who distrusted her couldn't point to specific violations of church law. Lucius was beginning to consider more creative approaches when opportunity presented itself in the most unexpected way. He was walking past her cottage one afternoon, ostensibly visiting a parishioner nearby, when Iris emerged to tend her garden. She wore a simple dress, hair pulled back, completely absorbed in examining her herb plants, and hanging at her throat, catching the pale winter sunlight, was a pendant Lucius recognized immediately. The sunstone. His breath stopped. He moved closer, pretending to admire the herb garden, close enough to see clearly. The crystal wasn't the clear, colorless gem he remembered from the royal treasury. It glowed with a faint pink hue, almost imperceptible unless you knew what to look for. Lucius knew. He'd studied the old texts, the forgotten histories that even most priests never read. The sunstone pendant wasn't just jewelry, it was ancient magic from the founding of Oakhaven, created to identify royal bloodlines. When worn by someone carrying no royal connection, it remained clear as water. But when worn by someone of royal blood, or someone carrying a child of royal blood, the crystal turned pink. And as the pregnancy progressed, the pink would deepen to red, blood red, unmistakable, impossible to deny. The healer was pregnant with the king's child. Lucius felt the ground shift beneath his feet. This changed everything. If Iris carried the heir Oakhaven desperately needed, killing her became infinitely more complicated. The king would be devastated. The kingdom would lose its future. Even Lucius, who'd orchestrated countless political maneuvers, couldn't justify destroying a royal heir, unless no one knew the heir existed until it was too late. He studied the pendant more carefully. The pink was still faint, barely visible. Most people wouldn't notice it at all. The healer herself clearly didn't understand its significance. She wore it openly, unaware it was broadcasting her condition to anyone who knew how to read the signs. And Silas, ignorant fool that he was, probably didn't remember the pendant's true nature. That knowledge had died with the old king's mother, the last person who'd understood the family's magical heritage, which meant Lucius might be the only person alive who knew what was happening. The realization hit him with the force of revelation. This wasn't a disaster. This was an opportunity. If he acted quickly before the pregnancy became obvious, before the pendant's color deepened enough for others to notice, he could eliminate the threat while everyone remained ignorant of what was truly at stake. The king would grieve, yes, but grief passed. And with the healer gone, Silas would return to his proper dependence on priestly guidance, would perhaps finally accept an appropriate arranged marriage, would resume his sacred duty without the distraction of inappropriate affection. The heir would be lost, but that was acceptable. Better no heir than a bastard heir who would destabilize the succession and legitimize the elevation of common blood to the royal line. Better for the kingdom to fail than for the natural order to be so fundamentally violated. Lucius made his decision in that moment, watching the pregnant healer tend her herbs with complete oblivious innocence. Lady Iris would die, soon, before the pregnancy advanced beyond the first few months, before anyone else noticed the pendant's changing color, before she could tell the king what she carried. It would need to be public, irreversible, and legally justified. A private assassination would raise too many questions. No, this required an accusation so serious that the king couldn't intervene without destroying his own authority. A crime that demanded immediate execution, leaving no time for investigation or appeals. Witchcraft. The charge was perfect. The local priests already suspected her methods. The common people feared what they didn't understand. And if Iris used dark magic to sicken the king himself to drain his life force in some unholy ritual, then burning her wouldn't be murder. It would be justice, necessary protection of the crown. Silas would sign the death warrant himself if Lucius played this correctly. The priest smiled, a thin expression of cold satisfaction, and began walking toward the cathedral. He had work to do, seeds to plant, evidence to arrange. The king's fever would need to be induced carefully, something that mimicked natural illness, while responding to Lucius's healing prayers at precisely the right moment. It would take time, perhaps a month, to establish the proper conditions. But Lucius was patient. He'd waited 30 years to accumulate his power. He could wait a few more weeks to preserve it. Behind him, in the garden with the blue door, Iris hummed softly to herself and touched the pendant at her throat without thinking. The crystal felt warm against her skin, almost alive, and lately she'd been experiencing unusual symptoms: fatigue, nausea in the mornings, a strange certainty that something fundamental had changed in her body. She suspected she might be pregnant, though it was too early to be certain, too early to tell Silas, who already carried such crushing weight. She wanted to be sure first, wanted to present him with joy, not uncertain possibility. She had no idea that someone already knew her secret, had no idea that her happiness had become a death sentence, had no idea that the man watching from the shadows had just decided she needed to die. The pendant glowed soft pink against her throat, and Iris smiled, thinking of the king who'd given it to her and the future they might build together. She had perhaps 4 weeks left to live. The poison was a masterpiece of subtlety extracted from nightshade root and aged for 3 months until its effects became nearly indistinguishable from natural illness. Lucius had learned the recipe from a text confiscated during a heresy trial years ago, a book he'd kept hidden rather than destroyed. Knowledge was power, even forbidden knowledge, especially forbidden knowledge. He added 3 drops to the king's wine during the evening council meeting, timing it perfectly. Iris had sent word that morning requesting Silas visit her cottage that night. She had something important to tell him. Lucius had intercepted the message through a servant he'd cultivated months ago for precisely this kind of work. He knew what the healer wanted to say, knew the pregnancy had progressed far enough that she'd finally gathered the courage to share her news. She would never get the chance. The council meeting dragged through its usual tedious agenda: grain distribution, tax collection, reports from the provinces. Silas listened with half his attention, clearly distracted. He kept glancing toward the windows, watching the sun descend, calculating how soon he could excuse himself and make his way to Ashwood Lane. Lucius watched the king drink the poisoned wine in small sips throughout the discussion. 1 cup, then a second. The toxin worked slowly, building in the blood until it reached critical concentration. Silas would feel nothing for hours, which meant he'd be nowhere near the priest when symptoms manifested. No suspicion would fall on Lucius. By the time the king collapsed, the wine would be long gone, the cup washed, the evidence erased. The meeting concluded just after sunset. Silas stood to dismiss the council, and Lucius saw the first sign, a momentary wavering, quickly corrected. The king's hand gripped the table edge for support. "Your Majesty?" Lord Chancellor Wexford asked. "Are you unwell?" "Fine," Silas said, but his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "Just tired. The late nights reviewing." He never finished the sentence. His eyes rolled back and he collapsed, crashing to the floor with enough force to overturn his chair. The council erupted in chaos. Lucius was the first to reach the king's side, performing his role with perfect precision. "Send for the court physicians immediately. Clear the room, give him air." They carried Silas to his chambers while servants ran in every direction, shouting for doctors and priests. By the time the king was laid on his bed, he'd begun to convulse shallow tremors that racked his entire body. His skin burned with sudden fever, and when his eyes opened, they held no recognition. "Iris," he mumbled. "Need to, tell her, can't." "Delirium," announced the head court physician. a pompous man named Aldrich who'd never correctly diagnosed anything in his 20-year career. The fever has reached his brain. We must bleed him to release the corrupt humors. Wait. Lucius stepped forward, projecting an aura of spiritual authority. Perhaps this illness is not entirely natural. Perhaps we should first seek divine guidance before applying earthly remedies. The physicians hesitated, unwilling to challenge the high priest's suggestion. Lucius used their uncertainty to position himself beside the king's bed, close enough to whisper without others hearing clearly. "I will pray for his majesty through the night," Lucius announced. "The rest of you may leave. I'll summon you if his condition changes." It was a reasonable request. Priests often maintained vigil over the sick, and no one thought to question it. Within minutes, Lucius was alone with the delirious king, and the real work could begin. He waited until Silas's fever dreams pulled him under completely, until the king thrashed and muttered incoherently. Then Lucius leaned close, his mouth nearly touching Silas's ear, and began to whisper. "The healer, Lady Iris, she's done this to you." Silas's head turned toward the voice, seeking something familiar in the chaos of fever. "She takes from you what she needs." Lucius continued, his voice smooth as poisoned honey. "Your strength, your vitality, your very life force. She drains it to preserve herself, to maintain her youth and beauty." "No," Silas mumbled. "Iris wouldn't. Blood magic, your majesty. Ancient and forbidden. She's been working her spell for months, slowly killing you while pretending to love you." Lucius let the words sink in, repeated them with slight variations. "Every time you visited her cottage, every time you touched her, she took a piece of your soul." He continued for hours, planting seeds of paranoia in the fertile soil of fever-induced delirium. Silas fought against the suggestions at first, but the poison made him vulnerable, confused, unable to distinguish truth from nightmare. Lucius wove his lies with careful precision, mixing them with genuine memories. The cottage visits, Iris's herbal remedies, her unorthodox methods until fiction and reality became impossible to separate. "She's killing you," Lucius whispered again and again. "The woman you love is a witch, and she's draining your life to feed her power." By dawn, when the physicians returned to check on their patient, they found the king still feverish but sleeping more peacefully. Lucius rose from his vigil with appropriate exhaustion. "I believe the worst has passed," the priest said. "My prayers have been answered, though His Majesty will need several days to recover fully." Several days. Just enough time to complete the trap. While Silas suffered through fever dreams in the castle, Iris waited in her cottage for a visit that never came. When morning arrived without word from the king, she grew concerned. When afternoon passed with continued silence, concern became worry. She wrote a letter carefully worded, sealed with wax, marked with the subtle signs Silas had taught her to use for urgent communications. She entrusted it to a messenger she'd used before, a young man who'd once been her patient and remained loyal. "Take this directly to the king," she instructed. "Place it in his hands yourself. No one else. Tell him I must speak with him. It's urgent." The messenger promised, pocketed the letter, and set off toward the castle. He made it as far as the cathedral steps before one of Lucius's servants intercepted him. "The king is gravely ill," the servant said with practiced concern. "No messages are being delivered directly to His Majesty. All correspondence must go through the high priest first, to ensure nothing disturbs his recovery." The messenger hesitated, but the explanation seemed reasonable. Everyone knew the king had collapsed during council. Protecting him from stress during recovery made sense. He handed over the letter. It reached Lucius within the hour. The priest read it in his private chambers, lips twisting into something that might have been satisfaction or disgust. "My dearest Silas, I have news that cannot wait. News that will change everything. I'm carrying your child, our child, the heir you've dreamed of. Please come to me as soon as you're able. I know this is unexpected, but I believe it's also miraculous. We have been given a gift, I love you. Always, Iris. Lucius read it twice more, memorizing every word, every hope she'd poured onto the page. Then he carried it to his fireplace and held it to the flames. The paper caught quickly, curling and blackening. Iris's careful handwriting disappeared into ash. The seal melted. Within moments, no trace remained except a faint smell of burned wax. Lucius watched until even that dissipated, then returned to the castle to continue his vigil. Over the next 3 days, Silas drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he surfaced, Lucius was there, reinforcing the poison he'd planted in the king's mind. Each time Silas asked about Iris, the priest had ready answers. She hasn't sent word, Your Majesty. Perhaps she knows you're ill and fears you'll discover her role in your sickness. The physicians found traces of unusual herbs in your system, herbs consistent with those the healer uses. Several witnesses have come forward with concerns about her methods. They say she boasted of having power over you. None of it was true, but truth became irrelevant in the fever's grip. Silas's rational mind, the part that would have questioned and demanded evidence, remained submerged beneath waves of delirium and induced paranoia. By the 4th day, when the fever finally broke and clarity returned, the damage was done. Silas believed on some fundamental level he couldn't quite articulate that Iris had hurt him, that her remedies had been poison, that her love had been manipulation. The beliefs felt wrong, contradicted everything he knew about her, but they'd been branded into his consciousness during his most vulnerable moments. And Lucius was there, always there, reinforcing them with carefully constructed logic. I know this is difficult to accept, the priest said gently as Silas sat up in bed for the first time, weak as a newborn. But the evidence is clear. She used your affection to gain access, then slowly drained your strength. It's a classic pattern in cases of blood magic. I need to speak with her, Silas said hoarsely. Let her explain. Your Majesty, that would be extraordinarily dangerous. If she can manipulate you once, she can do so again. Would you risk your life and your kingdom to give her another opportunity? Silas's hands trembled. His head ached. The memories of the fever dreams remained vivid visions of Iris's face twisting into something monstrous, her hands glowing with stolen vitality, her voice speaking incantations he couldn't understand. He knew they were fever dreams, knew they couldn't be real. But what if they were? What do you suggest? He heard himself ask. Lucius had been waiting for this question. Everything had been building toward this moment. An investigation, the priest said. A proper investigation into her methods and practices. If she's innocent, she has nothing to fear. But if the evidence supports what we suspect, he paused delicately, then justice must be served, however painful that may be. Silas closed his eyes. The room spun. He felt hollowed out, scraped clean, barely capable of forming coherent thoughts. Do what's necessary, he whispered. And Lucius smiled. In her cottage, Iris paced anxiously. A week had passed since she'd sent her letter. A week without word, without visits, without any explanation for Silas's absence. She clutched the sunstone pendant, which now glowed a definite pink visible even in bright daylight, and tried to fight the growing fear that something had gone terribly wrong. She had no idea her letter had burned to ash, had no idea the king she loved was being systematically turned against her, had no idea that soldiers were already being assembled for her arrest, that witnesses were being coached, that evidence was being fabricated. She had no idea that she had 3 days left of freedom before the trap closed completely. The court assembled at dawn, summoned by urgent decree. Every noble of rank, every counselor, every official with authority crowded into the great hall, while rumors swirled like storm winds. The king had been poisoned. Witchcraft was involved. Someone would answer for this crime. Lucius stood before them all, positioned at the center of the hall where light from the high windows illuminated him like a figure in a religious painting. He'd orchestrated this moment with the precision of a master playwright, the timing, the staging, the carefully prepared evidence that would damn Iris before she could speak a word in her own defense. My lords, My ladies, Lucius began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. I come before you with a heavy heart and grave news. Our beloved king has been the victim of malicious sorcery. An investigation has uncovered the perpetrator, a woman who used seduction and dark magic to gain access to His Majesty's person, then slowly drained his life force to preserve her own unnatural youth. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Lucius raised his hand for silence. Lady Iris, the so-called healer from the lower city, stands accused of witchcraft, blood magic, and attempted regicide. He gestured, and servants brought forward a table laden with items that made the nobles recoil in horror. Strange dried plants, their twisted roots suggesting something sinister. Vials of dark liquids that could be anything from medicine to poison. A worn book with anatomical drawings that looked disturbingly like diagrams for ritualistic purposes. And most damning, a collection of what appeared to be personal items belonging to the king. A handkerchief, a glove, objects that could be used in sympathetic magic to create connections between victim and spellcaster. These were discovered in her cottage during a sanctioned search, Lucius explained, his tone heavy with regret. The herbs are not medicinal, they are components of forbidden rituals documented in texts of dark sorcery. The book contains instructions for draining life force from victims. And these personal effects of His Majesty were found hidden beneath her floorboards, surrounded by ritual markings. Every item was genuine, in a sense. The herbs were medicinal, feverfew, willow bark, chamomile, but presented without context. They looked sinister. The anatomy book was a medical text, but its illustrations of human organs could be framed as something darker. The king's handkerchief and glove Lucius had stolen himself during his castle vigil, and planted in Iris's cottage during the search. The ritual markings were chalk drawings made by Lucius's own hand. But the assembled nobles didn't know that. They saw evidence and believed. Furthermore, Lucius continued, we have testimony from witnesses who observed her suspicious behavior. The first witness was brought forward, an elderly woman who lived near Iris's cottage, her face pale with fear. Not fear of the accused, but fear of the man who'd visited her home 3 days earlier and made clear what would happen to her grandchildren if she didn't cooperate. Tell the court what you saw, Lucius prompted gently. Lady Iris. I saw her performing rituals at midnight, the woman stammered. Strange words in languages I didn't recognize, lights that weren't natural. And the king visited her often, in disguise. Each time he left, he looked diminished, like something had been taken from him. The crowd gasped. More witnesses followed, each with damning testimony carefully coached by Lucius, a merchant who claimed Iris had boasted of having power over the king, a priest who swore she'd laughed when asked about divine law, a former patient who suddenly remembered feeling worse after her treatments, as though she'd stolen vitality rather than restored it. None of it was true, but truth had ceased to matter. The court was primed by fear of the blight, fear of witchcraft, fear of the unknown. They needed someone to blame for the king's illness and the kingdom's suffering. Iris was convenient. Lord Chancellor Wexford stood, his face troubled. These are serious accusations, Your Eminence. But shouldn't Lady Iris be given the opportunity to defend herself? To face her accusers? Of course, Lucius said smoothly. Justice demands it. But first, she must be secured. If she remains free, she might complete her spell and finish what she started. The king's life hangs by a thread. We cannot risk delay. The logic was impeccable, the fear palpable. When Lucius called for a vote on immediate arrest, not a single hand rose in opposition. They came for Iris just after midnight, 8 soldiers led by a captain who'd been promised advancement for his cooperation. They surrounded her cottage, weapons drawn, as though confronting a dangerous criminal rather than a woman who spent her days healing the sick. The captain pounded on the blue door. Lady Iris, open in the name of the king. Inside, Iris had been preparing for bed, exhausted from another day of treating patients and worrying about Silas's continued absence. The pounding startled her so badly she dropped the cup she'd been holding. It shattered on the floor. What's happening? She called, pulling a shawl over her nightdress and moving toward the door. You are under arrest for witchcraft and attempted murder of His Majesty King Silas. Open this door immediately or we will break it down. The words made no sense. Witchcraft? Murder? Silas was ill? Iris threw open the door, questions spilling out. What are you talking about? The king is ill? Is he? She never finished. Rough hands seized her arms, dragging her out into the cold night. She fought instinctively, trying to pull free, demanding explanations that no one would provide. Please, there's been a mistake. I'm a healer. I would never hurt anyone. I need to see the king. I need to speak with him. Save your lies for the trial, the captain growled, binding her wrists with rope that bit into her skin. They marched her through the streets like a common criminal. Windows opened. Faces appeared in the darkness to watch the spectacle. Word had already spread the witch was being arrested. The woman who'd bewitched the king. Iris recognized some of the faces, people she'd treated, children she'd saved, but none of them met her eyes. Fear had made them strangers. Silas! She screamed toward the castle looming in the distance. Silas, please, there's been a terrible mistake. But the castle remained dark and silent, and her voice was swallowed by the night. They took her to the cathedral dungeons, ancient cells beneath the holy building where heretics and criminals awaited judgment. The cell was small, cold, barely large enough to lie down in. Moisture seeped through the stone walls, and the only light came from a guttering torch in the corridor outside. I'm pregnant, Iris said desperately as they locked the iron door. I'm carrying the king's child. He needs to know, please. Someone has to tell him. The guards exchanged glances but said nothing. They'd been warned she would make wild claims, would use any deception to escape justice. Please, Iris pressed against the bars. Just let me see him. 5 minutes. Let me explain. There's been a terrible mistake. I would never hurt Silas. I love him. The king is too weak to receive visitors, came a voice from the shadows. Lucius stepped into the torchlight, his expression a perfect mask of sorrowful disappointment, especially from the woman who tried to kill him. You! Iris felt ice spread through her veins. She'd seen the high priest watching her cottage, had sensed his hostility during their few brief encounters. You did this. You're lying about me. I'm protecting the king from a dangerous witch who used seduction and sorcery to gain his trust. Lucius moved closer to the bars. Your spell has been broken, Lady Iris. His Majesty understands now what you truly are. No. The word came out as barely a whisper. No, Silas knows me. He knows I would never. He knows you bewitched him, made him believe he cared for you when it was merely magical compulsion. Lucius's smile was cold. When he recovered enough to think clearly, he authorized your arrest himself. The lie struck like a physical blow. Iris's knees buckled, and she caught herself against the cell bars. You're lying. He would never believe. He already does. The evidence is overwhelming. Your trial will be a formality. Lucius turned to leave, then paused. You should have been more careful, healer. Power always threatens those who wield it carelessly. I need to see him, Iris said, voice breaking. Please, just once. Let me tell him about our child. The desperate always claim pregnancy to escape justice, Lucius replied. It's the oldest lie of guilty women. The guards have been instructed to ignore such claims. Then he was gone, footsteps echoing up the stone stairs, leaving Iris alone in the darkness. She collapsed onto the thin straw pallet that served as a bed, body shaking with shock and terror. This couldn't be happening. It was too absurd, too obviously false. Silas would realize the truth. He would come for her. He would stop this madness before it went any further. Her hand found the sunstone pendant at her throat, still warm against her skin. The crystal now glowed a clear, undeniable pink visible even in the dim light of her cell. She clutched it like a talisman, like proof of everything she and Silas had built together. Please see this, she whispered to the absent king. Please understand. Please come. But the only answer was the drip of water on stone and the distant sound of rats in the walls. Above her, in the castle, Silas lay in his chambers, still weak from the poison and the fever. When servants brought word that the witch had been arrested, he felt nothing but a hollow relief that the threat had been neutralized. The woman's face kept appearing in his fever dreams, twisted into something monstrous, and he couldn't reconcile those images with his memories of love. Lucius had assured him this confusion was normal, the after effects of having his mind manipulated by magic. Time would clear his thoughts. Time would help him see the truth. What Silas didn't know was that time was the one thing Iris didn't have. The trial was scheduled for 3 days hence, and the verdict had already been decided. The executioner had been notified to prepare the pyre. The firewood was being gathered. In her cell, Iris held the glowing pendant and prayed to gods she'd never quite believed in, begging them to show Silas the truth before it was too late. The pendant pulsed warm and pink against her palm, bearing witness to the life growing inside her, the heir Oakhaven needed, the child who would never be born. And in the darkness above, High Priest Lucius smiled and planned his next move, confident that in 3 days his problem would be reduced to ash and memory. The trial convened in the great hall at noon, when light streamed through the stained glass windows and painted the stone floor in colors of blood and gold. Every seat was filled nobles in their finest robes. Merchants granted special permission to witness justice. Priests arranged in solemn rows. The crowd's anticipation felt hungry, eager for spectacle and resolution. Iris was led in wearing chains that rattled with each step. 3 days in the dungeon had left her pale and hollow-eyed, but she held her head high despite the trembling in her legs. The sunstone pendant hung at her throat, now glowing pink enough that anyone who looked closely might notice. But no one looked closely. They saw only what they'd been told to see: a witch, a seductress, a threat to the crown. She searched the assembled faces for Silas, but the king's throne stood empty. Too weak to attend, she'd been told. Still recovering from the illness she supposedly caused. The absence felt like abandonment, like the final confirmation that everything had gone irreversibly wrong. High Priest Lucius presided over the proceedings, positioned at a raised podium that gave him the appearance of a judge rendering divine verdict. Lord Chancellor Wexford sat beside him, nominally in charge of legal proceedings but clearly deferring to the priest's spiritual authority. Lady Iris of the Lower City. Lucius intoned, "You stand accused of witchcraft, blood magic, and conspiracy to murder His Majesty King Silas through supernatural means. How do you answer these charges?" Iris's voice came out stronger than she felt. "I answer that they are lies, complete and absolute lies." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Lucius raised an eyebrow with theatrical surprise. "You deny practicing medicine through unnatural means?" "I deny that medicine is unnatural," Iris replied, fixing him with a steady gaze despite her fear. "I use herbs and techniques documented in medical texts centuries old. Feverfew for headaches, willow bark for inflammation, chamomile for anxiety and sleeplessness. These are remedies, not spells. Yet you performed rituals at midnight. I boiled water for tinctures at night because that's when I had time, after spending my days treating patients who couldn't afford court physicians." Iris's voice grew stronger, fueled by desperate hope that someone would hear reason. "I use no incantations. I invoke no demons. I observe symptoms, identify causes, and apply treatments based on natural properties of plants. This is science, not sorcery." Science. Lucius made the word sound like blasphemy. "And yet His Majesty fell gravely ill after months of receiving your so-called treatments. Explain that." "I didn't treat the king for any illness, because he wasn't ill when I knew him." The words burst out before Iris could stop them, and she realized too late she'd confirmed the relationship Lucius wanted exposed. "He came to me healthy. He left me healthy. Whatever happened to him occurred after you'd already worked your spell," Lucius interrupted smoothly. "Blood magic operates slowly, draining vitality over time. The evidence presented to this court clearly demonstrates. The evidence is fabricated, Iris's chains rattled as she gestured desperately. Those aren't ritual components. They're medical supplies. That book isn't a grimoire. It's an anatomy text. I've never performed rituals or spoken incantations or done anything except try to help people who were suffering. Then explain these. Lucius gestured, and servants brought forward the king's handkerchief and glove. Personal effects of His Majesty. Found hidden in your cottage. Why would you possess these unless you were using them in sympathetic magic? Iris stared at the items, confused. I've never seen those before. Those aren't, I didn't take anything from the king. This is a setup. Someone planted. Convenient denial, Lucius said, turning to address the court rather than Iris. When confronted with evidence, the accused claims conspiracy. But consider would the high priest of Oakhaven, who has served the crown faithfully for 30 years, fabricate evidence against a simple healer? What possible motive could I have? The question hung in the air, seemingly rhetorical, but Iris knew the answer, knew that Lucius saw her as a threat to his influence, knew that he'd orchestrated everything to eliminate her before she could cement her place at the king's side. She opened her mouth to say so, then closed it. Who would believe her? The word of a common healer against the kingdom's highest religious authority? The witnesses were called next, each repeating their coached testimony. The elderly woman who claimed to have seen midnight rituals, the merchant who swore Iris had boasted of controlling the king, the former patient who suddenly remembered feeling drained rather than healed. Iris tried to refute each accusation, pointing out inconsistencies and impossibilities, but her voice was drowned by the tide of false testimony. The court wanted to believe the witnesses, needed to believe them, because if Iris was guilty, then the king's illness had an explanation. The kingdom's suffering had a cause. And most importantly, they had someone to punish a way to fight back against the helplessness that had plagued Oakhaven for months. I demand to see the king, Iris finally said, her voice breaking. Let him hear my defense. Let him tell this court whether I ever harmed him. He knows the truth. He knows me. His Majesty is too weak to attend, Lucius replied. Your spell has left him barely capable of standing. Subjecting him to your presence would risk his life. Then bring my testimony to him. Let me write a letter explaining. You already sent letters filled with lies and manipulation. They were intercepted and destroyed to protect His Majesty from further harm. The revelation hit Iris like a fist. Her pregnancy letter, the one she'd poured her heart into, revealing the child she carried, had never reached Silas. Had been intercepted, destroyed, rendered meaningless. He didn't know. He had no idea what he was about to lose. I'm pregnant, Iris said, her voice rising to a shout that echoed through the hall. I carry the king's child. I carry the heir Oakhaven has been praying for. You can't execute me. You'll be killing the future of this kingdom. The court erupted in shocked whispers. This was the claim Lucius had prepared for, but even he seemed momentarily taken aback by the raw desperation in her voice. He recovered quickly. My lords and ladies, he said, his tone sympathetic and sad. This is exactly the manipulation I warned you about. The desperate always claim pregnancy to escape justice. It's the oldest lie of guilty women, used throughout history to buy time or mercy. It's not a lie, Iris screamed. Examine me. Bring midwives to confirm. The child is real. I'm carrying the heir. Even if you were pregnant, which strains credibility given the timing, how could we know the child is royal? Lucius spread his hands reasonably. A woman who admits to an affair with the king might have had affairs with others. The child could belong to anyone. The child is Silas's. Tears streamed down Iris's face now. All composure abandoned. I've never been with anyone else. Never. This is his son, the heir he needs. You claim to know the child's gender already? Lucius pounced on the inconsistency. More evidence of supernatural knowledge. More proof of witchcraft. I don't know. I was just... Iris faltered, realizing every word was being twisted against her. Please just let me see him. 5 minutes. Let me show him the pendant. Her hand found the sunstone at her throat, clutching it desperately. The pink glow was obvious now. visible even across the crowded hall, but no one understood its significance. To them, it was just jewelry possibly stolen, possibly enchanted, but certainly not proof of anything except her connection to the king she'd supposedly bewitched. "The verdict," Lucius said, turning to Lord Chancellor Wexford. "I believe we've heard sufficient testimony." Wexford looked uncomfortable, clearly troubled by aspects of the trial, but too frightened or too practical to intervene. "The court finds the accused guilty of witchcraft and conspiracy to murder through supernatural means. The sentence, as prescribed by law, is death by fire, to be carried out at dawn tomorrow." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of satisfied murmuring through the crowd. Justice had been served. The witch would burn. The kingdom could begin to heal. Iris's legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees, chains clattering, and the guards had to haul her upright. She looked up at the empty throne where Silas should have been, where the man she loved should have been defending her, protecting her, seeing the truth that everyone else was blind to. "Silas," she whispered, though he couldn't possibly hear. "Please wake up. Please see what they're doing. Please save our child." But the throne remained empty, and the hall began to clear. Nobles filing out with the satisfaction of having witnessed justice efficiently rendered. They would sleep well tonight, secure in the knowledge that evil had been identified and would soon be eliminated. As guards dragged Iris back toward the dungeons, she caught one final glimpse of Lucius. The high priest watched her with an expression of cold satisfaction, like a man who'd executed a difficult task flawlessly. He'd won. They both knew it. In less than 24 hours, Iris would be dead. The child she carried would be lost, and Silas would never know what he'd allowed to be destroyed. Back in her cell, Iris curled into a ball on the straw pallet and wept not for herself, but for the tiny life growing inside her. A child who would never draw breath, an heir who would never inherit the crown meant for him, a son or daughter who would die because their father had been manipulated and their mother had been convicted of crimes she never committed. She clutched the sunstone pendant until it left marks in her palm, praying for a miracle that wouldn't come. Above, in the castle, Silas finally managed to stand and walk to his window for the first time since falling ill. He felt hollow, scraped clean, barely recognizable to himself. Servants had informed him the witch's trial had concluded successfully. Justice had been served. He should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt nothing but a vast, aching emptiness he couldn't name. "It's over," Lucius said from the doorway, having followed to check on his patient. "By tomorrow the threat will be eliminated. You'll be safe to recover fully." "Good," Silas heard himself say, but the word tasted like ash. Tomorrow at dawn, they would light the pyre. Tomorrow, everything Lucius had worked for would be secure. Tomorrow, the problem would be solved. Neither of them knew that the pendant, glowing pink in a dungeon cell below, was already showing the truth they'd refused to see, that tomorrow's execution wouldn't just kill a woman. It would kill the future of Oakhaven itself. The fever returned with vengeance the night after the trial, as though Iris's conviction had triggered some sympathetic magic even Lucius hadn't anticipated. Or perhaps it was simply the poison's final surge before leaving Silas's system entirely, one last assault on his weakened body before releasing its grip. Silas thrashed in sweat-soaked sheets, caught between waking and nightmare. The boundaries dissolved until he couldn't distinguish memory from hallucination, truth from fever-spawned fantasy. He saw Iris's face beautiful, beloved, then watched in horror as it melted and reformed into something monstrous. Her eyes glowed red, her mouth stretched too wide, revealing teeth like broken glass. Her hands reached for him with fingers that ended in claws, and when she touched his chest, he felt his life draining away, drop by precious drop. "No," he moaned, trying to pull away from the vision. "Iris, no." But the nightmare Iris only smiled, cruel and triumphant. "Did you think I loved you?" Her voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. "You were always just a vessel, a source of power to be drained dry." He tried to argue, tried to remember the real Iris, the woman who'd laughed at his jokes and challenged his assumptions and kissed him with such fierce tenderness. But the memories felt distant, faded, like something that had happened to someone else in another lifetime. "She's killing you." Lucius's voice cut through the fever dream, an anchor to something resembling reality. "Can you feel it, Your Majesty? How she's taking everything, your strength, your will, your very essence." Silas's eyes cracked open to find the high priest beside his bed, illuminated by candlelight that made his gaunt face look skull-like. Or was that also fever? He couldn't tell anymore. "How long?" Silas croaked. 4 days since your collapse. You've been fighting her spell, but it grows stronger. She's in the dungeons now, but her magic still reaches you through the connection she forged." Lucius's voice held sorrowful certainty. "The bond must be severed completely, or you'll die." "How?" The word emerged as barely a whisper. "The death warrant. Her execution will break the spell. It's the only way." Silas's fevered mind tried to process this. Death warrant, execution. The words felt heavy, wrong, but the logic seemed sound through the fog of illness. If Iris's magic was killing him, if she'd manipulated everything between them, then stopping her would save his life, would save the kingdom. In moments of clarity, he resisted. Some distant part of him observed, as though watching from outside his own body. "No, she wouldn't. Iris wouldn't hurt me." The protest felt true, rang with conviction that cut through even the fever's distortion. Iris had been kind, brilliant, genuine. Every moment with her had felt real in a way nothing else in his life did. She'd seen him, truly seen him, and chosen him anyway. That couldn't have been manipulation. It couldn't have been. The fever surged again, dragging him under. The nightmare Iris returned, her face shifting between beauty and horror. "Sign it," she hissed. "Sign the warrant and set yourself free. Or die knowing you were too weak to save yourself." "That's not her," Silas tried to say, but his voice wouldn't work. "She wouldn't say that. She wouldn't—" "Your Majesty." Lucius's voice grew more urgent. "Please. The kingdom needs you. Your people need you. You must be strong enough to do what's necessary." Something cool and hard was pressed into Silas's hand. A quill. He felt parchment beneath his other palm, rough and official. "Just sign," Lucius urged. "Sign and the pain will end. Sign and you'll recover. Sign and save yourself. Save the kingdom." The words became a rhythm, a chant, pounding in time with his racing heartbeat. "Save yourself. Save the kingdom. Do what's necessary. Be strong." His hand moved almost of its own accord. Muscle memory from thousands of signed documents overriding conscious thought. The quill scratched across parchment his signature, written in a shaking hand that barely resembled his usual script. "Good," Lucius breathed. "Very good, Your Majesty. The spell is broken now. You'll recover." As the priest's words washed over him, Silas felt himself sinking into darkness that might have been sleep or unconsciousness or something deeper. His last coherent thought was a question he couldn't quite articulate. What had he just signed? When consciousness returned hours or days later, he couldn't tell. Silas found himself alone in dim afternoon light. His fever had broken. The sheets beneath him were cold with dried sweat, and his body felt like it belonged to someone else, all weakness and trembling limbs. But his mind was clearer. The hallucinations had receded. He could think, and with thought came memory of what he'd done. The death warrant, he'd signed it, had authorized Iris's execution while barely conscious, barely capable of understanding what Lucius had placed before him. Horror rose like bile in his throat. No. What have I? He tried to sit up, but his body refused to cooperate. He managed to raise his head enough to call out weakly, "Guard! Someone! I need." The door opened immediately, admitting a servant who'd clearly been stationed outside. "Your Majesty, you're awake. Praise be." "Fetch the high priest," Silas commanded, his voice gaining strength. "Immediately. And Lord Chancellor Wexford. I need to speak with them. About," he swallowed hard, "about Lady Iris. The warrant I signed. It needs to be." I'm here, Your Majesty. Lucius entered with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment. How are you feeling? Confused. Weak. Silas forced himself to focus through the exhaustion. The death warrant. When I signed it, I wasn't. I need to review the case properly. To speak with the accused. There are things that don't. The case has been concluded, Your Majesty. The trial was yesterday. The verdict was unanimous, guilty of witchcraft and conspiracy to murder. The sentence will be carried out at dawn. The words hit like physical blows. Trial, yesterday, dawn, which meant hours away, not days, not enough time to... I want to see her, Silas said. Bring her to me. I need to hear her defense in her own words. Your Majesty, that would be extraordinarily dangerous. Her spell on you was powerful. Seeing her again might allow her to reestablish the connection. I don't care about the danger. Silas's voice hardened with what little authority he could muster. I am king. I will see the accused before her execution. That is my right and my command. Lucius's expression remained perfectly sympathetic, perfectly reasonable. Of course, Your Majesty. However, I must inform you that such a meeting may no longer be necessary. The accused confessed. Silas's breath caught. What? After the trial, when the reality of her situation became clear, Lady Iris requested an audience with me. She confessed to everything, the manipulation, the love potions disguised as headache remedies, the slow draining of your vitality, she said. Lucius paused, as though the memory pained him. She said she'd been foolish to think she could maintain the deception, that she'd gotten greedy, tried to take too much too quickly. She begged for mercy, for a quick death rather than the flames. Each word felt like a knife sliding between Silas's ribs. It couldn't be true. Iris wouldn't confess to crimes she didn't commit, unless the torture had broken her, unless the fear had been too much, unless she'd been offered some bargain, confess and die quickly, resist and suffer. God, what had they done to her? I need to see her, Silas repeated, but his voice had lost its conviction. She also asked that you not witness her death. Lucius continued gently. She said she was ashamed, that seeing your face would make the end harder. She wanted you to remember what you believed you shared, not what it actually was. The lies were perfect, each one crafted to cut deeper than the last. Lucius had anticipated every possible objection, every path Silas might take toward the truth, and blocked them all with fabricated compassion. When? Silas heard himself ask. When is the execution? Dawn, in a few hours. Lucius moved closer to the bed. Your Majesty, I know this is difficult. You believed you cared for this woman. The spell made those feelings seem real, but they weren't. The woman you thought you knew never existed. There was only the witch, using you for power. Silas closed his eyes, and behind his eyelids he saw two versions of Iris. The nightmare version from his fever dreams, monstrous, cruel, draining his life. And the real version, or what he remembered as real, laughing in candlelight, arguing about medicine, kissing him with desperate hunger. Which one was true? Let me rest, he said finally, unable to reconcile the contradictions. I need to think. Of course. Lucius bowed and withdrew, satisfaction hidden beneath layers of performative concern. Alone again, Silas stared at the ceiling and tried to remember. Tried to find the truth buried beneath fever dreams and manipulation. But his mind felt scoured clean, emptied of certainty. Every memory of Iris now came with doubt attached. Had she really loved him, or had Lucius been right about the manipulation, the spell, the systematic destruction of his will? He wanted to believe in what they'd shared, desperately wanted to believe it had been real, but belief required strength he no longer possessed. As night deepened toward dawn, Silas lay awake and did nothing. Made no move to stop the execution. Told himself he was too weak, too confused. That if she'd confessed, then perhaps the evidence really was overwhelming. He told himself many lies that night, The truth that he was afraid, that doubt had poisoned every certainty, remained unspoken. In the dungeon below, Iris clutched her pendant and prayed for a rescue that would never come. She'd heard nothing since being dragged back to her cell after the trial. No word from Silas, no reprieve, no miracle. Just the slow countdown to dawn, and the flames that waited. The sunstone pendant glowed pink against her throat, bearing witness to the life inside her that would die with the sunrise. The heir Oakhaven needed. The child Silas would never know existed. The truth that would turn to ash before anyone could see it. Dawn broke gray and lifeless over Oakhaven, the sky a sheet of iron that promised nothing but cold. In the central square, the pyre stood like an obscene altar log stacked in careful architecture, kindling stuffed between the gaps, the whole construction rising 10 feet high with a stake driven through its center. Oil had been poured over the wood, its acrid smell mixing with the morning mist. By decree, attendance was mandatory. Every citizen who could walk was required to witness justice being served, to see what happened to those who practiced witchcraft and threatened the crown. They came reluctantly, filling the square in uncomfortable silence, merchants and laborers, mothers clutching children, old men leaning on walking sticks. Fear had driven them from their homes, fear of being accused themselves if they failed to appear. Lucius stood on a raised platform adjacent to the pyre, flanked by priests in ceremonial robes. He surveyed the crowd with satisfaction. Everything had proceeded exactly as planned. In moments, the problem would be eliminated, reduced to ash and cautionary tale. The king would recover fully without the healer's influence. Order would be restored. The cathedral bells tolled 6 times, and the crowd stirred. Guards emerged from the dungeon entrance, surrounding a figure in chains. Iris walked between them with what dignity she could muster, though her legs trembled and her face was chalk white. 3 days of imprisonment, and the terror of knowing exactly how she would die, had carved hollows beneath her eyes and left her looking like a ghost already. But the sunstone pendant still hung at her throat, glowing pink in the gray morning light. Lucius had deliberately allowed her to keep it. This was his final cruelty. His perfect irony let her wear proof of the pregnancy to her death. Let the evidence burn with her. Let no one ever know what they'd destroyed. When Silas finally discovered the pendant's true nature years from now, when he realized what the pink glow meant, the knowledge would destroy him far more thoroughly than any accusation could. The crowd parted as Iris was led toward the pyre. She searched every face desperately, looking for one that mattered above all others. But Silas wasn't there. The space reserved for the king remained empty, his throne on the platform unoccupied. He wasn't coming. He'd abandoned her completely. The realization nearly broke her last reserves of strength. But as guards began binding her to the stake, wrapping rope around her waist and chest to hold her upright when the flames took her consciousness, Iris found her voice one final time. "I am innocent," she called out, loud enough for the entire square to hear. "I healed your children. I eased your pain. I asked for nothing in return except the chance to help." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some faces showed uncertainty, people she'd treated, families whose loved ones she'd saved. But fear kept them silent. "I loved your king," Iris continued, voice breaking. "I loved him honestly, without deception or magic. And I carry his child, the heir you've all been praying for. You're not executing a witch. You're murdering your future." The crowd erupted in angry shouts. "Liar!" someone screamed. "Witch!" called another. The priests had done their work well, whipping the people into righteous fury over the past days. They needed to believe in Iris's guilt, needed someone to blame for the kingdom's suffering. "Please," Iris begged, tears streaming down her face. "Someone examine me. Bring midwives to confirm what I'm saying. The child is real. You'll be killing the heir to the throne." "The desperate always lie," Lucius announced, his voice carrying across the square. "She claims pregnancy because she knows it's her only chance at mercy. But even if she carried a child, which seems highly unlikely, how could we know it belongs to His Majesty? A woman who admits to an affair might have had many lovers." "Only Silas," Iris sobbed. Only ever him. Please, someone has to believe me. A commotion at the edge of the square cut her off. The crowd turned, then hastily parted. King Silas emerged, supported on each side by guards, his face the color of old parchment, and his body visibly shaking with the effort of standing. He dressed in full royal regalia despite his weakness, crown, ceremonial robes, the weight of office he could barely carry in his current state. Lucius's satisfaction flickered to alarm. The king wasn't supposed to attend. He'd been ordered to rest, to preserve his strength. But there he was, moving through the crowd with painful determination toward the platform. Iris's heart nearly burst. "Silas," she cried, and all the love and desperation she felt poured into his name. "Silas, please. Our child, you have to stop this. I'm carrying your son." Their eyes met across the space between pyre and platform. For one eternal moment, Silas stared at the woman he'd loved, or thought he'd loved, bound to a stake and begging for her life. He saw the pendant at her throat, pink and glowing, saw the terror in her eyes, heard the absolute conviction in her voice, and felt nothing but confusion and the lingering poison of Lucius's manipulation. "Your Majesty!" Lucius moved quickly to intercept, positioning himself between the king and the condemned woman. "You shouldn't have come. You're still too weak." "I needed to see," Silas said hoarsely. "Needed to witness." "Of course. It's natural to want closure." Lucius lowered his voice to a whisper only Silas could hear. "But don't listen to her lies, Your Majesty. This is what they do, make final desperate claims to manipulate your emotions, to re-establish the spell. You must be strong." "Silas, please." Iris screamed, struggling against her bonds. "Look at the pendant, the one you gave me. It's pink. Do you understand what that means? It's showing the truth. I carry your child." But Silas didn't understand. Didn't remember the pendant's significance. The knowledge had died with his grandmother, and Lucius had ensured no one else could explain it. "My love." Iris wept, and the endearment cut through the crowd's noise. "Please remember. Remember the cottage. Remember what we shared. Remember that I love you, that I would never hurt you, that everything they've told you is lies." Silas wavered, memory and doubt warring across his face. In that moment, he looked like a man being torn in half, wanting to believe, afraid to hope, paralyzed by uncertainty. "The kingdom waits, Your Majesty," Lucius said quietly. "End this curse. Save yourself and your people. Do what must be done." The crowd took up the chant. "End it! End it! End it!" A guard stepped forward, offering Silas a torch already lit and burning. The flames danced orange and hungry, eager to spread to the oil-soaked wood. Silas took the torch with a shaking hand. He looked at Iris, really looked at her, and saw the woman he'd laughed with, argued with, loved with an intensity he'd never experienced before. Saw her pregnant and terrified and condemned because of him. "Forgive me," he whispered, though whether to her or himself or God, he couldn't say. The torch fell. It tumbled through the air in slow motion, spinning end over end, trailing sparks. It landed in the kindling at the base of the pyre. The oil caught immediately. Flames erupted with a roar, spreading faster than thought, racing up the carefully stacked wood toward where Iris stood, bound and screaming. "I carry your child," she shrieked one final time. "Silas, I carry your son. You're killing your heir." But her voice was already being swallowed by the roar of the fire and the roar of the crowd and the roar of Silas's own blood in his ears. He stood transfixed, horror and certainty finally crashing together too late, watching the woman he loved disappear into smoke and flame. Iris screamed until the smoke stole her breath, screamed the truth that no one would hear, screamed her love and her grief and the name of the child who would never be born. The sunstone pendant glowed brilliant pink against her throat, pulsing with the life inside her, proof visible to everyone, understood by no one. It would survive the flames, Lucius knew. Crystal didn't burn. It would be found in the ashes, color transformed to something unmistakable, and only then would the truth be revealed. Only then would Silas understand what he'd destroyed. The king stood frozen on the platform, unable to look away, unable to move, watching the fire consume everything. Smoke rose thick and black, carrying ash toward the gray sky. The crowd fell silent, their bloodlust satisfied, their need for justice temporarily sated. And in the flames, Iris's screams finally, mercifully, stopped. Silas collapsed, unconscious or broken, guards barely catching him before he hit the ground. They carried him away from the execution, away from the smoke and ash, back toward the castle where he could be protected from the consequences of what he'd done. Lucius watched the pyre burn, satisfaction and relief flooding through him. It was over. The threat eliminated. His position secured. The king would recover, would accept an appropriate arranged marriage, would produce a legitimate heir with proper noble bloodline. Everything had gone exactly as planned. The fire burned for 3 hours before finally dying to embers. By then, the square had emptied, citizens returning to their homes with the grim satisfaction of having witnessed justice. Only guards remained, waiting for the ashes to cool enough to be cleared away. In the castle, Silas lay in his chambers in a darkness deeper than unconsciousness, his mind refusing to surface into a reality where he'd just burned the woman he loved alive. And in the dying embers of the pyre, the sunstone pendant rested among ash and charred bone, glowing blood-red now, its color deepened by heat and tragedy, bearing witness to the truth no one had been willing to see. The heir Oakhaven needed was gone. The future of the kingdom had burned to ash. And the king who'd lit the match would never be the same. The fire had burned all through the morning and into the afternoon before finally surrendering to ash and ember. By the time the sun hung low in the western sky, nothing remained of the pyre but blackened wood and gray dust that the wind scattered across the cobblestones. The guards had cleared away the larger debris, leaving only the fine ash that would be swept up by servants in the morning. The crowd had long since dispersed, returning to their homes with the grim satisfaction of having witnessed justice served. They would sleep well tonight, believing the kingdom was safer, that the curse had been lifted, that their suffering would finally end. They were wrong about everything. Silas had been carried back to the castle unconscious, his body finally surrendering to the combined assault of lingering poison, physical weakness, and the horror of what he'd done. They laid him in his chambers, and the court physicians pronounced him stable, but deeply traumatized. Best to let him sleep, they said. Let his mind and body recover together. But sleep offered no refuge. His dreams were filled with smoke and screaming, with Iris's face disappearing into flames, with her final words echoing endlessly. I carry your child. You're killing your heir. He woke in the dark hours before dawn, alone in his chambers, clarity returning like a blade sliding between his ribs. The fever was completely gone. His mind felt sharp, almost painfully clear. And with that clarity came the ability to see what he'd been blind to for weeks. The manipulation, the carefully constructed lies, the systematic destruction of everything he'd valued. Iris. God. What had he done to Iris? Memory returned in fragments. The cottage with the blue door, her laugh, her brilliant mind, the way she'd challenged him and seen him and loved him without pretense. It had been real. All of it had been devastatingly real, and he'd burned her alive. The realization hit with such force that Silas doubled over, retching, though his stomach was empty. He'd murdered the woman he loved based on fever dreams and the word of a priest whose motives he'd been too sick to question, had signed her death warrant while barely conscious, had dropped the torch himself while she screamed the truth he'd refused to hear. I carry your child. The words haunted him. She'd said it so many times at the trial, from the stake, in those final desperate moments before the flames took her. What if she'd been telling the truth? What if everything Lucius told him was lies? Silas dressed with shaking hands, pulling on simple clothes without calling for servants. He needed to see, needed to know, needed some proof of her guilt or his unforgivable mistake. The castle slept as he made his way through corridors and down into the courtyard. The guards at the gate looked surprised to see the king walking alone at such an hour, but they knew better than to question. They opened the gates and watched him disappear into the pre-dawn darkness. The central square was empty when Silas arrived, gray and ghostly in the dim light. The execution ground looked obscene in its ordinariness, just a circular patch of scorched stone where something irreversible had occurred. Ash covered everything, still faintly warm beneath the morning cold. Silas fell to his knees at the edge of the burn mark. His hands, still shaking, reached into the ash. It was soft and fine, like powder, clinging to his skin and staining his fingers gray. He sifted through it with desperate intensity, looking for something though he couldn't name what. Proof. Closure. Forgiveness that would never come. The ash still held warmth from yesterday's fire. It coated his hands, his clothes, worked its way under his fingernails. Bits of charred wood crumbled at his touch. Fragments of bone small, broken, made him recoil in horror before forcing himself to continue. Then his fingers closed around something solid, something smooth and impossibly intact. Silas pulled it from the ash with trembling hands. The sunstone pendant emerged like an accusation, the silver chain blackened but whole, the crystal glowing in the pale dawn light. Glowing blood red, not pink, not the pale clear crystal he remembered giving Iris. Blood red, deep and undeniable, pulsing with inner light that seemed to burn brighter as he stared. The pendant fell from his nerveless fingers, landed in the ash with a soft sound. Silas stared at it, mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. Red. The pendant was red, and somewhere in the broken fragments of childhood memory, he heard his grandmother's voice explaining what that meant. The sunstone knows truth that men deny, dear one. Clear as water when held by common blood, pink as dawn when royal seed takes root, red as fire when the air grows strong. Royal seed, an heir, growing strong enough to turn the crystal from pink to red. Iris had been telling the truth. About everything. The sound that tore from Silas's throat was barely human anguish, and rage and grief compressed into a scream that echoed across the empty square and through the silent streets beyond. He collapsed forward, hands clutching the ash where Iris had stood, where she'd burned, where she'd died still trying to save the child he'd murdered. His son, his heir, the future of Oakhaven, reduced to ash because he'd been too weak, too manipulated, too afraid to see the truth. He screamed until his voice broke, until his throat bled, until nothing remained but raw, gasping sobs. The pendant lay in the ash before him, glowing red like an open wound, bearing witness to the unforgivable. Your Majesty. Footsteps approached at a run. Silas looked up through tear-blurred vision to see Lucius hurrying across the square, robes billowing, face arranged in an expression of concern that now looked obscene. Your Majesty, you shouldn't be out here alone. You're still recovering. Silas rose slowly, ash coating his clothes and hands and face like a shroud. He picked up the pendant, held it out toward the high priest. What color is this? His voice came out as a rasp, barely controlled. Lucius's eyes fixed on the glowing crystal, and for just a moment, satisfaction flickered across his features before he could suppress it. I don't understand. What color? Silas roared, and the high priest actually flinched. Red, Your Majesty, but I don't see what... You knew. The words fell like stones into still water. You knew what this pendant meant. You knew she carried my child, and you killed her anyway. Your Majesty, I assure you. Don't. Silas stepped forward, and Lucius retreated instinctively from the murder in the king's eyes. Don't speak. Don't justify. Don't dare to tell me this was necessary or for the good of the kingdom or any other lie you've been feeding me. She was a threat to the natural order. She was pregnant with my heir. The scream echoed off the surrounding buildings. She carried the child Oakhaven has been praying for, and you convinced me to burn her alive. Lucius's mask finally cracked, revealing the cold calculation beneath. A bastard heir born to common blood would have destroyed everything we've built. The noble houses would never have accepted. Silas hit him. His fist connected with Lucius's jaw with enough force to send the priest sprawling into the ash. The king stood over him, pendant clutched in one hand, the other hand raised for another blow. "You manipulated me," Silas said, voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Poisoned me, fed me lies while I was delirious, intercepted her letters, orchestrated her arrest and trial, convinced me to sign her death warrant while I could barely think." Lucius touched his bleeding lip, staring up at the king with something like fear. "I did what was necessary to preserve the crown. You murdered my child." Each word fell like a hammer blow. "You destroyed the woman I loved. You made me complicit in the greatest crime of my life." Silas's voice dropped to something cold and final. "And you did it all to preserve your own power." He could kill Lucius now, right here, with his bare hands, strangle the life from the priest who'd orchestrated this nightmare. Part of him desperately wanted to make someone pay for the unbearable weight of what he'd done. But killing Lucius wouldn't bring Iris back, wouldn't resurrect the child who'd burned before drawing first breath, wouldn't change the fact that Silas himself had dropped the torch, had refused to listen, had chosen fear over love. "Get out," Silas said instead, voice hollow. "Leave Oakhaven, tonight. If you're still within the kingdom's borders by sunrise tomorrow, I'll have you executed for treason and murder." "Your Majesty, you're not thinking clearly." "Get out," the roar sent birds scattering from nearby rooftops. "Before I change my mind and kill you where you kneel." Lucius scrambled to his feet and fled, robes trailing through the ash, leaving Silas alone in the gray dawn with the pendant burning red in his palm. The king sank back to his knees in the ash of the woman he'd loved and the child he'd murdered. The pendant pressed against his chest, warm as living flesh, accusing with every pulse of crimson light. The kingdom had wanted to know why the land was cursed, why crops failed and livestock sickened, why no heir came to secure the bloodline. They'd blamed witchcraft, divine displeasure, blood magic, but the curse had never been external. The curse was Silas himself, a king so desperate to save his kingdom that he'd destroyed its only salvation, so afraid of being manipulated that he'd let himself be manipulated into committing the unforgivable. He'd had everything he needed: love, an heir, a future, and he'd burned it to ash because he'd been too weak to trust, too frightened to hope, too willing to believe the worst about the best thing in his life. The sun rose over Oakhaven, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, the same colors as the pendant, the same colors as the flames that had consumed Iris. Silas remained kneeling in the ashes as light spread across the square, as the city woke to discover their king broken beyond repair, as the truth settled into his bones with the permanence of scars that would never heal. He'd gotten his answer about the curse, and the answer was him. The kingdom would die now, slowly but inevitably, ruled by a hollow man who'd murdered his own future. The bloodline would end. The land would continue its decay, and every moment of suffering would be punishment justly earned. Silas closed his fist around the pendant until the edges cut into his palm, drawing blood that mixed with the ash on his skin. "Forgive me," he whispered to the empty air, to the ghost of the woman who'd loved him, to the child who would never be born. "Forgive me." But the only answer was the wind scattering ash across the cobblestones, carrying away the last physical traces of everything he'd destroyed. And the pendant glowed red in his hand, bearing eternal witness to the truth he'd discovered too late. He hadn't just executed a witch. He'd murdered his own unborn son. If this story gripped you, there's more where it came from. Subscribe for more tragic tales of love, betrayal, and the devastating cost of blind faith. Stories where kingdoms fall, hearts break, and truth arrives one moment too late. And I will see you in my next story.